Hello and welcome to the World Soccer Talk podcast. My name is Christopher Harris. I'm joined by my co-host Kartik Krishnaiyer. Kartik, let's catch up first of all and talk about some of the soccer that we've been watching recently, either in person or on television. For me, it's been a crazy couple of weeks of watching everything from the Bundesliga 2, the opening kickoff in that game, which was Hamburg against Schalke, and then watching a bunch of European soccer friendlies, Juventus against Real Madrid, Chelsea against Fulham, Brighton against Newcastle, as well as my team, Swansea, preseason friendlies, Liverpool against Bayern, Inter Miami, of course, against a lot of these other teams out here. Atlanta United, but most recently Orlando City. So basically, watching lots of friendlies, watching Leagues Cup and some other Leagues Cup games too. That's been my last week or so, just watching those. I know, and a little bit of Women's World Cup, a little bit here, a little bit there, but I know yours, Kartik, is probably completely different. What have you been watching, either in person or on television?
Yeah, so in person, I went to the Gulf Coast Premier League's finals weekend, both on the men's and women's side in that regional league. I've been watching USL League 2 playoffs and NPSL playoffs and every minute of the Women's World Cup. I've watched a little bit of Leagues Cup. I have not watched a single minute of a European club friendly, although I guess maybe the MLS All-Star game counts as that, so then... With the exception of the MLS All-Star game, I haven't watched any European clubs at all. So it's kind of a completely different subset of soccer that I'm watching, and it's something I'm finding very frequently. Like people are either, and I think the division is really people are either watching the Leagues Cup or they're watching the Women's World Cup, and there's a clear divide on that's going on.
Yeah, I think it's. Well, I think you have those different subsets, right? The people watching Leagues Cup, which is mostly watching Inter Miami games. You've got the subset of people watching Women's World Cup, and then you have another subset, which is probably miscellaneous, which would be watching everything from European friendlies to the Bundesliga 2, et cetera, right? There's other leagues that are happening right now too. I mean, the Scottish League Cup have been having games, stuff like that, pretty much miscellaneous category. And I think that's my feeling is in terms of with the Messi games, watching those with Inter Miami, that to me at least, they've become a must watch. Every single game that Inter Miami's played with Messi, Busquets, and now Jordi Alba, to me have been a must see. So much so that I think they're eating into the Women's World Cup viewership, and the reason for that, why I say that, is it's almost impossible to watch the Women's World Cup and the Leagues Cup. It's almost like you have to make a choice, because most of us work from 9 to 5, whatever the hours are. And then we may watch, say, a Leagues Cup game or one of these, the Soccer Champions Tour, as an example, which has been playing to mostly sold out stadiums and pretty decent viewership on ESPN and ESPN2, and then go to bed and then repeat the same thing the next day. The Women's World Cup for me personally is just kind of been left out because I can't function with like no sleep. So I know it is almost a choice. You have to decide, okay, are you going to be watching those games, whether it's Leagues Cup or European friendlies, or are you watching Women's World Cup? And I don't think you can do both.
No, you can't. And in fact, for me, what's ended up happening, I traveled this past weekend to go to those finals and had to kind of scramble to catch up on Women's World Cup action. Although it's funny, at the final, everybody was talking about the Women's World Cup and not talking about Leagues Cup. But I know if I went to some random game somewhere else, it would probably be the opposite. But here's what's happened to me. Like the first few days of the Women's World Cup, you and I spoke about this on the last podcast. We've spoken about this privately. I tried to stay up and watch every game live, and it threw my sleeping patterns off. It was affecting my work. People that I work with were complaining, right? You're half asleep at 1 p.m. So then I decided, okay, I'll start DVRing all the matches, but watch them in their entirety, which I've done since. Now, What that does, Chris, is that ruins your appetite to watch any other soccer during the day. So now I'm watching Women's World Cup matches when I wake up or in between things with work or work commitments, etc., family commitments, and I'm caught up with the tournament. I've watched every game in the tournament in its entirety at some point, whether it was live or a day later, whatever. But that means I'm not watching any other soccer, basically, because then that's my soccer viewing during the day when maybe I would be focused on Leagues Cup or friendlies, the Champions Soccer Champions Tour or what have you. So this has kind of happened before when we've had international tournaments that have been July, August tournaments, whether it's the Olympics or there have been some years Gold Cup has been late, but never to this extent. I don't think in the past when we've had late Women's World Cups, I remember even the 2007 Women's World Cup was taking place in September and October, if I remember correctly, the competitiveness of the women's game is at such a level now that you can't just assume someone's going to win a game and not pay attention to the tournament and say, okay, I know who's going to be in the quarterfinals and the semifinals. I'll pick it up then. In fact, and maybe this is another topic for discussion, Chris, this tournament has been more competitive than any men's tournament I remember. I mean, it's just crazy how the women's game went from being, I think, far less competitive at the international level than the men's game. I mean, there's still 5 or 6 countries every men's World Cup that can win a World Cup, you think, but it's limited to that subset. To the women's game now being like the nations with pedigree are the ones that are really struggling in this tournament. Like every former World Cup winner, with the exception of Japan, has struggled in this tournament. Every World Cup finalist, teams that have gotten to the finals and maybe not won the World Cup, with the exception of Japan and maybe you could argue the Netherlands to a certain extent, has struggled in this tournament. So it's just crazy, and that's making it more essential to keep up and watch every game, which is taking away from other soccer for someone like me.
So outside of the US women's national team, in terms of the viewership that they've been getting for their games, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? And what I mean by that is, are people, yes, the Women's World Cup in terms of Germany crashing out and Jamaica making it through and Colombia and all these great stories, which does show an enormous change in the Women's World Cup game in terms of these countries in the past that would not have been able to knock out these bigger teams. Brazil not making it through to the next round.
Yeah, but Canada, the reigning gold medalist, that's a big one.
Yeah.
Too.
But if very few people are actually paying attention to it, does it matter? Well, I think it matters. But the feeling I'm getting is very few people are paying attention to it, other than the U.S. women's national team fans watching those games.
Yeah, in the U.S. I mean, in England, there's a frenzy going on, which you would expect, and it's going to be interesting with the Premier League. The Championship and EFL kicking off this week, and the Premier League next week, where the fandom goes, because Kira Walsh is injured, right? I mean, she's got a serious Achilles injury, but there's just a feeling now that England is the team, right? They're the favorite because of all of these other things that have happened, and in England, like it's starting, like it's coming home. That talk. So that's interesting. But in the U.S., what we're concerned about on this podcast, yeah, I think you're right. Outside of the women's national team, and in fact, you mentioned Germany, you mentioned Brazil. I just mentioned Canada, and the great stories are Jamaica, Morocco, South Africa, etc. There seems to be so little attention being paid to the rest of the tournament by many in the U.S. I don't think they realize Canada is out. A big favorite is out. Brazil is out. A big favorite. Germany, the other kind of rival in terms of winning lots of things in the women's game to the U.S., is out. And the U.S., for all their problems, are still standing. So that goes to your point that people aren't paying attention to the rest of the tournament, because actually, of the nations with significant pedigree and having won things recently, the United States is really the one still standing, other than England, obviously.
Yeah, and what I said too wasn't meant to be a criticism of women's soccer. I mean, I'm a big fan of women's soccer. It's more so in terms of just the play-in times, the kickoff times. It's almost, unless you choose to watch the Women's World Cup, and and don't have anything happening during the daytime. You're sleeping during the daytime and watching the games at night, or you're in college or you're in high school and you got the summer off, and you can do that and watch as many games as possible. For the vast majority of us in the US, working day jobs for the most part, it's almost impossible to really kind of cover or even to watch the Women's World Cup in as much as many games as we would the Men's World Cup, just because of the kickoff times, not because of a choice between the one or the other.
And this is really important in terms of the U.S.'s failure to win its group, because FIFA assumed, obviously, the U.S. have won the last two Women's World Cups. FIFA tailored the kickoff times of both the U.S. group, two of the three U.S. group games, and then the knockout stages where they thought the U.S. would progress in the bracket to U.S. primetime television. So, in fact, now what's going to happen is the Netherlands are going to be playing in U.S. primetime television, and the U.S. is going to be playing overnight in the U.S. because they failed to win the group. So, even more costly in terms of getting people interested in the tournament is the U.S.'s futzing around in these last two matches, for lack of a better term, because they now have really blown it for Fox and for Telemundo in terms of viewership because of not winning the group. Because, in fact, the U.S. games, as I think you probably have noticed too from doing the television schedules, Chris, have been isolated from the rest. The U.S. and Canada games, actually, have been isolated from the rest of the tournament in order to maximize potential viewership in those two countries. And the times of the rest of the games in the tournament have been just kind of standard local time. And now the U.S. and Canada have both screwed that up.
Yeah, and that's the thing though too, is that so the U.S. women's national team game, the next game where they play Sweden in the second round, that one is at 5 a.m. Eastern time. And if they had finished first in the group, that game would have been played at 10 p.m. Eastern time. Is a huge difference between. Most of us probably can say like, hey, we'll stay up from 10 to midnight, no problem, watch the game. But if it's a 5 o'clock in the morning Eastern time, 5 to 7, do we get up early and watch that? But the other part of this though too, Kartik, and this is completely by coincidence, is it seems that almost every single game that Messi's played with Inter Miami has conflicted with the US women's national team. Not completely at the same time, except for the first game, right? Their first game against Cruz Azul, which was both games were played at almost the same exact time. The other games too, even this game against which game was it? It was the Miami game against Orlando was on the same day as the US game, and it's one's in the morning, one's at night. But in order to watch, if you want to try to watch both, unless you're you can survive on just a couple of hours sleep, it's really really difficult. So that's
and the other piece of that, honestly, Chris, is that because the U.S. has been playing so poorly in this tournament, you might have just had like the normal, hey, the game's over, we talk for a few minutes, and then you're on to watching Orlando versus Miami, you're watching Messi. But because the U.S. has played so poorly, like the community that's concerned about U.S. soccer has been texting and calling each other about what a disaster this U.S. team is and how bad the coaching is and all the talking points, and that's then kind of affected our ability to view the League's Cup matches. So it's also a byproduct of the U.S. being so poor in this tournament. I mean, I can't stress how I know there are a lot of men's national team fans who are like, oh, well, Berhalter sucks and, we should have done more. But no, the U.S. is what they are in the men's game. And I think we vastly overrate our players. And round of 16 is basically the ceiling maybe you get to the quarterfinals with a little better coach or better luck. But the U.S. women's national team is the gold standard in the women's game. And the performances in this tournament have been worse than the U.S. men's performances in the World Cup. Worse. Mm-hmm. Maybe the results have been similar, but the performances themselves have been worse. So the alarm bells are going off, and because of that, we're not focusing on other things, honestly.
Yeah, the fact that even Leagues Cup is eating into some of the viewership of the U.S. women's national team games, or the Women's World Cup games especially, is definitely a plus in the favor of the Leagues Cup and Major League Soccer and Liga MX, where, say, maybe without Messi in this competition and without Busquets and without Alba, maybe people would really not pay much attention at all. So that's good news for Leagues Cup in that they are battling, head to head with the Women's World Cup, and people like ourselves and listeners and others are having to make choices between, okay, which ones do I watch, or do I skip the Leagues Cup completely and watch the European friendlies almost every night, really, on television or at ESPN Plus. Going back to the Women's World Cup, what you mentioned too, Kartik, about the US Women's National Team, so far so underwhelming in terms of the performances. What did you make of Carly Lloyd's comments about the US Women's National Team post-match, where she was criticizing Megan Rapinoe and teammates for dancing and celebrating for getting a 0-0 draw against Portugal and moving through to the next round?
Well, Carly Lloyd was on a team in 2015 that underwhelmed in the group stage. Now, we were all tweeting at the time, free Carly, and Carly got freed because of Lauren Halliday's suspension, and she got pushed forward, and Morgan Bryan got put in the team. I think I've told the story a million times, so no need to repeat it. And she then had an epic knockout stage, and we won the World Cup. But getting through the group still means something because, look, Germany is out, Canada is out, Brazil is out. So I don't buy that completely, and I think unfortunately it's a hard game. Portugal, yes, I know previous U.S. meetings versus Portugal, 10 meetings, we've outscored them 39-0. But as you and I both know, Chris, as people who follow the women's game, the European nations and now the African nations are catching up. Africa has looked very good in this World Cup, by the way. Even Zambia, who got eliminated, the one African team not going to the knockout stages, had a fairly good tournament. So I think it's a different world. I don't necessarily agree with Carly Lloyd saying like their priorities aren't winning. I don't think that's true at all. That having been said, I do think she's right about the culture. There's something about the ruthlessness of the U.S. women's national team culture, which I think, by the way, had been lost prior to Carly Lloyd's generation. I think we tend to focus on the fact that the U.S. won all these gold medals in the Olympics, 2008, 2004, 2012. But really, at the World Cup level, we were chasing games, and we had one default tactic, which is to play the ball forward to Abby Wambach and hope she could make magic. 2003, 2007, 2011, this happened. 2008, we won the Olympics with her hurt, by the way. But 3, 7, and 11, this happened, and I didn't see any like progression. I just thought the U.S. was, when we got to the final in 2011, really lucky, and Japan beat us. But I do think there's a lack of ruthlessness. But knockout stages are completely different. I don't know if Carly Lloyd, I think she's right about the lack of ruthlessness and maybe the lack of leadership. I think this is why I don't like Becky Sauerbrunn being hurt and not being on the team. I may have still burned the roster spot and taken her to the World Cup if she couldn't have played because of that leadership in the dressing room. And then Kelly O'Hara, who I think is probably the most natural leader still on the roster, veteran leader, not really playing. You need other players in people's faces. You need other players leading. I think Julie Ertz may be the best leader left. But I do think Carly Lloyd has a bit of an agenda, because she didn't like Vlatko as a manager. We know that. I think she's kind of right about the tactical naivety, because I think if there's one real takeaway from this tournament, Chris, and it also includes like men's coaches now becoming coaches on the women's side, coaching is making all the difference because the tournament is so balanced, tactics and coaching. But I didn't like her criticizing the dancing and stuff, because I think we still got out of the group and it was really nervy the last 10 minutes. So there's this kind of release, right? This release of tension. Okay, we can breathe now. And that lends itself to kind of what we saw, because really, based on the evidence in stoppage time, Portugal should have gotten a goal somewhere and moved on, and the U.S. would have been out.
Yeah, I think actually from Carly Lloyd's comments and criticizing some of the teammates or former teammates on the U.S. Women's National Team, I think that's a good thing, because from watching her in her analysis of the Men's World Cup in Qatar, she was so milquetoast throughout that entire tournament, would not say anything controversial, would never give a really strong opinion. It was just so blasé. And it wasn't just her, it was Lallis and the whole crew doing the Men's World Cup in the studio. So finally, you got a little bit of a reaction, a little bit of a strong opinion out of her, criticizing just the players, kind of celebrating making it to the second round. Yes, there was a sense of relief there, but to me, that's not a good look in terms of putting in a really poor performance against Portugal, poor performance really against Vietnam. That result should have been much better, and against the Netherlands too, right? It just like basically three poor performances, and you're celebrating, dancing, having fun. It's not a good look, especially for viewers who wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning Eastern time and take time out of their day to watch that game, make a commitment, make a sacrifice to watch that game, and then they're just like laughing and having fun. Yes, privately do that, but don't do that in front of the cameras. Focus on your game, because your game is not good enough. And to me, Kartik, you may disagree with me, but I think the US has got a really difficult time against Sweden.
Yeah.
So, and even if they find some way to beat Sweden, it's likely that they'll play Japan in the next round, and Japan will absolutely beat them, definitely.
Yeah, I think the Sweden thing is interesting because so the thing I pointed out already is no two national teams in the world have had as much success against the United States in the U.S.'s period of hegemony, of dominance of the women's game, as Sweden and Japan. And those are the potential next two opponents. Now, the question I have is maybe the tables turn because the U.S. is now an underdog. I mean, the U.S. has played Sweden in 6 straight World Cups and 2 straight Olympics, and the results are pretty mixed, right? Sweden has beaten the United States a lot, including in the last 2 Olympics, including the only group stage loss the U.S. has ever had in its history was to Sweden in 2011. Maybe the tables are turned with Sweden as, I think, the clear favorite, and then if the U.S. plays Japan, Japan is the overwhelming favorite. That having been said, I think the way maybe they get lucky and they beat Sweden, as good as Sweden has been. But I think you're right about Japan. The way Japan sets up, the way they play, the way they counter, the way they attack spaces, they'll probably rip this U.S. team apart. I mean, it might be as bad as the game against Brazil. Let's not forget, the U.S. lost to Brazil 3 or 4-0 in the 2007 World Cup, Women's World Cup. There was a dip at that point, and because the U.S. was still winning gold medals in the Olympics, we kind of historically don't focus on that. I think that a game against Japan could be as bad, quite honestly. Could be 3 or 4-0.
Yeah, going back to the Messi and Inter Miami effect, and having people watch more of the Leagues Cup, the viewership is okay, and that's the thing too. Again, it's the black box. Nobody knows how many people are actually watching the games on MLS Season Pass. Could they be in the millions? Could they be in the hundreds of thousands? Could they be in the tens of thousands? Nobody knows, and that information is not being released. So all we have to go on is the TV viewing numbers, which aren't exclusive. So if Univision shows a game, or Unamas or Tudo shows a game, or FS1 shows a game, also MLS Season Pass shows those games. And for the most part, from what we've seen with the Leagues Cup, FS1 numbers have been really low. Nothing big there at all. And Univision numbers have been a little bit lower than what traditionally they would get for Liga MX. But again, some of those viewers might be watching it on MLS Season Pass. But I would say, Kartik, I think if this continues the way it's heading, and Messi's certainly, and Inter Miami are certainly providing a great games to watch, enthralling, really, really fun games to watch. This could have an impact on the Premier League viewing and viewership, which is going to start in about a week from now. If we're going to see situations again too, where we've got, say, Inter Miami playing FC Dallas. Or maybe it's as they go through the rounds of this Leagues Cup. If they do progress, maybe they play in California, and we have a game that's kicking off at 10 p.m. or 11 p.m. Eastern time. Is that might impact Premier League viewership in the mornings, kind of those early morning games, the 7:30 kickoff, or a 9 a.m. Eastern kickoff, because people are then having to choose, okay, do I watch the late game with Messi, with Inter Miami, or do I not watch that and then get up really early to watch the Premier League? And that, for me, Kartik, I cannot remember the last time this happened, where there's a possibility, or that we're even having the discussion of Major League Soccer games impacting viewership of Premier League matches, where hardcore soccer fans are having to make a choice. And maybe it was the Beckham era, but I don't remember it that way. What do you think, Kartik?
Yeah, well, I mean, actually, in the Beckham era, MLS's ratings were pretty similar to Premier League's ratings, right? And the Premier League has
True.
taken off since then, and MLS has stayed stagnant in its numbers. So, yeah, I mean, since that point, it would be the time. Yeah, I mean, I feel like I know there are a lot of people who have gone to Premier League, what are they calling them? Summer Showcase, that tournament that Chelsea won.
Summer series.
Summer Series that NBC has shown the game. So I know people have been interested in that. But in my kind of my circle, it feels like the Premier League is less relevant or less talked about than ever, even at this stage of the summer when transfers are going on and everything is happening because of these two simultaneous events. Now, we knew the Women's World Cup would take away some of it because that's always a big deal in the U.S., but Leagues Cup, credit to some in MLS and Liga MX. I mean, they had the vision for this thing. I mean, we didn't know they were going to get Messi and Busquets, but yeah, I just feel like it will eat into the Premier League viewership. But the good news is for the Premier League, right? They have a 9-month season. The viewership will recover. There will no doubt be storylines of importance that perk up. Although I'm kind of at a loss to describe why I would be excited about the Premier League season. I mean, other than Pochettino going to Chelsea and Villa making a couple of really key signings and wanting to see if they could push on, I'm just and Luton being in the Premier League, that's very exciting. But beyond that, it's like I'm not really jazzed up for the season. I think maybe when the season kicks off, I'll get into it. But yeah, it's very weird at this point, and I think it's going to affect viewership.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest though, like almost every year you're the same way, Kartik, where you're like going into it like, I'm not really excited, and then you start watching it and you're like hooked. And for me, I'm excited. I mean, the Premier League is the best soccer league in the world. To me, it's the most fascinating in terms of even the teams getting promoted from the Championship up, teams getting relegated, and you look up and down, even the Premier League. So many big transfer signings this summer, so many interesting stories that are going to really captivate and draw people to watching those matches. I mean, that's my opinion. But watching the Leagues Cup, and again, going back to that black box where we don't know what the numbers are of people watching the Leagues Cup games, in some ways, a lot of it comes then down to perception. Is the perception among you and I that a lot of people are actually really interested in Leagues Cup and watching the games? Because we don't know what those final numbers are. If we had those final numbers and compared it to, I don't know, Soccer Champions Tour that just ended, or the Gold Cup, or the Premier League Summer Series, maybe they actually are nowhere near those numbers, right? And it could be that, they're actually that the perception of the competition is much greater than what the reality is. I think a lot of this is really the Messi thing. The Messi effect, the Messi mania, whatever you want to call it, is there's so much hyper focus on every single thing that he does, which is fantastic, which is great. I'm in on it too. It's great to watch. That I think people start to exaggerate, or people start to think that the numbers are actually greater than what they are. And I'll give you two examples real fast here too, because I'm kind of monitoring what people are saying just to see what they're saying and what numbers have been released. And this comes from the Liga MX's president, Mikel Arriola. And he said in an interview this week with the Columbus Dispatch, he says, we saw the second best match for TV in the history of the United States with soccer, which was the Messi game. Well, that is not true. Unless he has some numbers that he's willing to share with other journalists or
it was actually the second
public.
Best match that night, actually, because the U.S. game still did like 7 million viewers on linear television.
Right, exactly. So by him saying that the Messi game, which I'd assume this is the one against Atlanta United, maybe it was a Cruz Azul game. By him saying that this was the second best match for TV in the history of the United States, it's completely not true. And like you said, Kartik, even on that same night, the U.S. women's national team had greater viewing numbers. And you go down the history of even MLS games, the numbers that have been publicly made available in terms of viewership, those are much greater than what we were, what was released from the the Univision numbers for that Cruz Azul Inter Miami game. So if he's willing to share those numbers from the Apple TV side of things to give us an idea of actually how many people are watching it, that's fantastic news. That's great. We'll publish it. We'll go ahead and run and let people know. But by saying that in an interview, you mean it's completely not true.
Yeah, and again, I mean that night, the night he's referring to, which is the Cruz Azul game, I have to assume he's referring to that because that's the only time Miami
Right.
played a Mexican team. The Women's World Cup did 7 million that night. I mean, all this malaise and kind of angst about the team hadn't set in yet at that point, although that Vietnam performance was underwhelming for sure. But still, between Telemundo and Fox, it was a ridiculously high number, and it was a number that actually had me thinking, "Oh wow, Women's World Cup is going to be a bigger hit this time than it's ever been," because we hadn't seen that sort of number in a first group game for the U.S. before. But unfortunately, the combination of the timings and the U.S.'s play now has the thing petering out. But which I think you have to factor that into the League's Cup surge, Chris, is how poorly the U.S. has played and how in the Women's World Cup and how disappointed people have been by it.
Yeah, so that's the first number I saw where I was like, wait a second, what is that Liga MX president saying? Because that is not true, completely not true. So there's a lot of exaggeration going on here. The second example, Kartik, just to talk about the Messi effect, which again, before I mention this, yes, I'm sure numbers have gone through the roof in terms of merchandise, ticket sales, social media interest, and I'm sure viewership has gone up too, but those viewership numbers have not been released, other than what Univision shares through Nielsen, as far as how many people are actually watching those games, which most of the games in Leagues Cup are exclusive to MLS Season Pass. So the next example and final example, Kartik, because I could go on and on about this, but the reason I'm doing this too is I want to keep people in check. So when they say these things, if they're not true, someone should call them out on it because it's not fair. So the second example, and this is somebody that you and I both love, a person that we have a lot of time for, we know very well. I think he's a great analyst. I'm sure you do too, Kartik. Thomas Rongen. So Thomas Rongen is a CBS Sports analyst, often appears on their coverage, especially on CBS Sports HQ, is a radio commentator for Inter Miami. So he was interviewed this week on CBS Miami, the local station. And he was asked about the Messi effect or the Messi mania. And he said 5.2 billion people saw Messi come on as a sub on Apple TV. And then he went on to go ahead and say that the game was watched by more people around the globe than any other soccer game. Well, both of those things are not true. So I called him out on it. I said, Thomas, where are you getting these numbers from? Because these are not true. And he's like, oh, okay, yeah. The 5.2 billion people that came to see Messi come on as a sub in the game on Apple TV. Actually, I was talking about the social media numbers. And so that's the thing, though, too, is when people say this and they're interviewed by Columbus Dispatch or interviewed by CBS Miami, and they're saying information which is categorically not true, someone needs to call them out on it or ask them about it. Okay, can you share those numbers? Give us some more details about that. Because which is fantastic, right? In terms of that goal that Messi scored, both in the Cruz Azul game and in the game against Atlanta United, many goals so far, those are fantastic social media moments. But that does not mean that those people are watching the games. They're just watching social media clips. And we've seen from Wrexham, right? Wrexham had a ton of people, millions of people watching the clips of Ben Foster making that save in the last minute in that game, which helped them get promoted. How many people actually were watching that game streaming on National League TV? Probably, 10,000 people, but the actual social media plays got, I think, over 10 million or 20 million people watching those. And so you can't base the actual viewership on social media views of clips.
Social media is a driver. Again,
for sure.
To talk about, to restate my trip out to Alabama this past weekend for the Gulf Coast Premier League final, the only moment in English football, the entire season, that was talked about by people at that game was Ben Foster's save. So Wrexham, through social media, is reaching an audience that maybe aren't watching the Premier League. I mean, so I do see some value in what Rongan might be saying, but at the same time, it's categorically false because they're using the verbiage or the language of television ratings and viewership and these sorts of things that we have always accustomed with viewership for linear television, which very plainly, very clearly, I'll restate, that game against Cruz Azul had far fewer viewers on linear television than the US-Vietnam game in the United States. Now, there might have been billions of people watching Apple TV in other territories. We don't know. We'll never know. But in the United States, there were more people watching the US-Vietnam game at the exact same time.
Right, exactly. So I mean, again, Messi is having an impact on Major League Soccer, on Liga MX, and on social media, and on soccer in this country for sure. But we have to kind of keep those numbers in check a little bit in terms of, not get too far ahead of ourselves, not go exaggerating how huge and amazing this is. It's funny too. I'm not sure if you caught this, Kartik. Craig Burley came back from ESPN from a vacation on ESPN FC, and I think Kay Murray asked him, like, "So what do you think about Messi mania? Like, isn't this amazing? Like, what's your take on it?" and I think he was just being honest. He was like, "Well, yeah, this is great for Inter Miami. More people are going to be watching those games and buying tickets, but what does it mean for the rest of the league? Does it mean that people are going to sign up for MLS Season Pass to watch those other games, right? To watch Colorado Rapids or FC Dallas or Seattle Sounders or whoever it may be?"
I'll tell you what a big problem. Sorry to cut you off, Chris, but this just occurred to me. With so many social media clips of Messi's heroics for Inter Miami circulating so freely, it may actually undercut Apple's ability to get people to sign up for MLS Season Pass if their only interest is in Messi and Busquets, which I think you and I suspect is the case with a lot of people.
No, that's a great point. That's a really good point. There was an article this week, actually, I think, I can't remember which publication, talking about highlights in general, where, younger age groups they don't have the time or patience to watch a complete sports game, like a soccer game. So they consume highlights. And you're right, Kartik. Those highlights are available usually within a minute of a goal going in. And MLS is doing a great job of kind of, distributing those, which is helping to promote and grow the number of followers they have, but also the awareness about, here, this is what's happening. But at the detriment of probably people not signing up for the service sometimes. No, that's a great point, Kartik.
Yeah, this is also why I think so many U.S. fans overrate our men's players, but that's a subject for another day because they're just watching highlights and they don't watch full games, and they think these guys are world beaters when in fact they're just kind of journeyman players. But anyway, continue.
Right. Well, we saw a perfect example of that this week was Serginho Dest, who was playing in the friendly this week and got completely. He looked awful, really, really bad. It was actually El Clasico. It was Barcelona against Real Madrid, and Vinny Jr. just really, made him look like an amateur level in terms of his defending skills. And now Barcelona says that they're planning on releasing him, that no clubs are interested in signing him. And he's gone on a path. He's played in Italy, he played in the Netherlands.
Yeah,
he went
there
to
were
Barcelona.
People who told me he was better than Kyle Walker. I'm not kidding. There were U.S. fans who told me this. I don't want to start on this, but anyway.
All right, before we move on, Kartik, a couple of things here too. We're getting more details, and I'm sure we'll have an article at worldsoccertalk.com with more details. But we've got some good news. The Bundesliga, which is starting, I think, next week, is going to have its own whip around show. So it's going to be the Bundesliga conference, and it's going to be on ESPN Plus. So for those 9:30 a.m. kickoff games, where there's usually about 6 games happening at the same time, they will have a whip around show, which I think is incredible. I think it's amazing. Even that's perfect, and it's been long needed. But I wonder, Kartik, is there any league right now? I guess Serie A. Serie A is the only one that's a major league that doesn't have it, that probably needs it. Actually, La Liga too, right? La Liga and Serie A, although a lot of the games are staggered kickoff
Yeah,
times.
that's the problem with both those leagues.
Yeah, so I mean, Serie A sometimes have a bunch of games on Sunday mornings happening at the same time, but anyway, for the Bundesliga fans like yourself and others, I think this is a great move, and this is going to help increase the awareness and increase viewership of Bundesliga games on ESPN Plus.
Yeah, I think it's really much needed because even for me, I'm fiddling between games at that 3:30 local time, 9:30 Eastern time kickoff. So I've had I've at times will admit now that I'll never have to do it again. I have gone and found pirated streams of the Bundesliga conference in the past, not recently, but in several years ago, because that's the only way to see everything simultaneously.
Right, unless you have the multi-view on Apple TV, and then you can have 4 games on the screen at one time. Although I mean, yeah, it's fantastic to do that, but sometimes it's so hard to follow. It's better to have someone guide you through a whip around show, going, okay, all right, we're going to break away from this coverage of Bayer Leverkusen, and we're now going to go over to a game with Mainz or Freiburg or whatever it may be, because something amazing just happened. That in many ways I think is a better experience to watch for as a viewer, less stressful sometimes too. So that's good news. Championship, Kartik, it comes back on Friday, August 4th. Sheffield Wednesday in action, right? I believe it is in against Southampton in the first game of the season. You and I both gave our predictions of who will get promoted, and the final tables of 1 through 24 for the English Championship, and those you can find at worldsoccertalk.com. We have the news today that now that we're recording this, that Tom Brady is now a major investor in Birmingham City, who my team Swansea City plays this
Who I
Saturday.
picked to be relegated in that preview. So I'm already wanting to change my predictions.
I think I predicted that they'd get relegated too. I think, or at least like kind of one away from the drop. But yeah, so it's back. I mean, obviously for those people who don't know, you appear on Talk Sport throughout the year as really kind of the English Championship expert on Talk Sport Radio. Oftentimes on Thursday nights or Friday nights, sometimes late at night. Well, not late at night UK time, but Eastern time is like 7 o'clock or 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock, depending on what time it is. So what's your level of interest in the championship coming back this weekend, and what are some of the stories that you're looking ahead to and getting excited about?
Yeah, quite high. I was on Talksport last night actually to talk about the season coming up. Although we focused more on League One and Wrexham, not surprisingly. Wrexham is in the UK also, huge story. The big thing I'm looking at is Middlesbrough. I think full season under Michael Carrick with the system of play and keeping that team pretty much together. I think they are going to give the newly relegated teams a real run for their money. I think Leicester City has done their business early, right? So their outgoings, Harvey Barnes, James Maddison, Tielemans, the three standout players on the team, really. But they got them out the door early. They're not affecting the camp. I think they've got kind of a solid squad. I don't know what's going to happen with the other two newly relegated teams. Leeds still have not gotten some of the guys out the door they need to get out the door. I'm not even sure that they have the grit or the fight to compete in the championship, although I still kind of, just based on talent, put them in the top six. Southampton have the Lavia situation. I think you might have some opinions about their manager, Russell Martin. I do think another storyline to watch this season is whether or not we see Watford, Norwich, and West Brom, these traditional yo-yo teams now that have had a couple of seasons down in the championship, whether one of them is able to pop back up. I think Norwich has the best chance of that group. I'm not that high on this Watford team. I think they've held together a lot of the talent they have, but it's just too dysfunctional situation. West Brom, maybe West Brom can push forward. So those are really the storylines I'm looking at. Relegation wise, I think you're probably going to see a situation where both Ipswich and Sheffield Wednesday, who have come up from League One, are really strong enough to maybe be mid-table, which is going to pull some teams that have been in the championship for a couple seasons into a relegation fight and potentially towards relegation.
Yeah, for me, the stories I'm most interested in are the new managers at Leicester, Southampton, and Leeds, and how they do in the championship. Because players have come in and gone out, but how will those managers adapt and carry on those clubs? Because they're going to definitely benefit from parachute payments, and Leeds now with new owners, with the San Francisco 49ers taking over the majority ownership. How much money are they going to invest in the club? And also too, with the transfer window too, the transfer window isn't shut yet, so it's always difficult to make predictions before the season begins because the window doesn't close until the end of August. So lots can change there. But overall, though, too, what I would say about the championship is, yet again, it's completely unpredictable. I think a lot of people last season were saying that Luton Town had a chance of getting relegated, and there they go and get promoted, which that is going to be an incredible story to watch in the Premier League, in that tiny Kenilworth Ground stadium, which I think is going to be the smallest ground ever for a Premier League team. And not only is it small, but it's antiquated beyond belief. So that's what I'm looking at is just the unpredictability and watching a lot of those games as usual on ESPN Plus, and then for those games that are not on ESPN Plus, subscribing to iFollow to pay. I think I'm going to just pay on a per game basis and then see how things go. But yeah, it's always exciting. It's great to have the fans back, and I'm looking forward to watching some championship football this weekend, as well as I'm sure Leagues Cup and some Women's World Cup and much more. So, Kartik, we're going to bypass and skip the listener mailbag this week, but we'll be back next week to read out your comments. So, listeners, if you do have any questions for us or you want to discuss anything that we have mentioned on this podcast, let us know. We would love to hear from you. There's a bunch of different ways to reach out to us. One of them is voicemail, which you can leave at 561-247-4625. We're also available through email, which is web@worldsoccertalk.com, facebook.com/worldsoccertalk. You can leave a message there. Twitter, you can add us, or X, God, you can X us. You can X us at World Soccer Talk and let us know if it's a comment for the podcast. And then what else is that? youtube.com/worldsoccertalk. You can leave comments there. And of course, the website, worldsoccertalk.com. You can click on the podcast navigation item in the main nav bar, and then just leave a comment in the most recent episode. And we would love to read that out on a future episode. Kartik, what's happening at Beyond the 90, and where can listeners reach out to you through Beyond the 90 and social media?
Yeah, thanks. Beyond the 90, we're doing some reporting on internal politics and controversies within NPSL. Other than that, I think we're in complete Women's World Cup mode. So really not jumping into the men's game other than that NPSL thing currently. Although with the championship starting, I think we probably are going to have to fire back up our Around the EFL segment. You can find me on Twitter. I will still call it that, even though I know it's X. It really bothers me when I see the X icon on my phone. Honestly, it's just like, what is this? But I'm at KKFLA737, and of course, you might want to check out our championship projections at WorldSoccerTalk.com, because I have a hunch, Chris, because you're right. This is the most competitive division in world football, really, that we probably will be wrong with all our predictions. That's just the way the championship goes.
Right. Yeah, which is what makes it so great. And one more thing, too, another shout out there, too, is for those of you who play Fantasy Premier League. We have a private league set up. So if you just Google it and say Fantasy Premier League, worldsoccertalk.com, you can find that. So you can Join that; it's free, and then pick your fantasy squad for the Premier League season. I've already been putting some names in there. Onana is one player I'm really excited about for Manchester United, and of course, there's going to be some transfers in and out, but that's always fun. Do you play that one, Kartik, or you play a different fantasy Premier League game?
I'm in a really competitive league that might have promotion and relegation this year, starting this year, and 20 teams, so and money. So I'm preparing for the draft on Sunday. Actually, have to begin to prepare for it, and then I probably will jump into our league also. But it's done a little differently. But I mean, my league is done not through the Premier League website, but just a different service. And I'm thinking there are a lot of guys that might be undervalued. Kai Havertz might be one of them. As much as I bashed him in the past at Chelsea, I think he's going to fit into the system Arteta has and the style Arteta has much better than the rotating managers and rotating players around him at Chelsea allowed him to be. So keep an eye on him. I'm planning on drafting him if I get the chance, by the way.
Interesting. Yeah, the one thing I do love about Fantasy Premier League is by having the ability to watch a lot of preseason friendlies. So whether it's the Soccer Champions Tour or some of these other games are played in the United States, oftentimes it gives us a good opportunity to see some of these players before most people in England and elsewhere around the world get to see them. And so sometimes the prices are undervalued before the season begins. And then all of a sudden they score a hat-trick on opening day, and then the price just skyrockets. So I kind of use it. Go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry.
No. Yeah, I was done. Go ahead.
I was going to say be careful with that because I've done that in the past because I've seen guys in preseason games. I've gotten cute in my draft, and then a couple weeks later had to kind of reconfigure my team. So it can go both ways.
Yeah, I think I remember many years ago, Andros Townsend putting him in, saying like, "Oh my God, he's going to be like firing up the Premier League."
Same with him, exactly.
And then he didn't get much right. All right, listeners. Well, thank you so much for listening to this podcast. We will be back next week. We hope you're enjoying your summer vacation or summer days in the heat, no matter where you are in the world. And we'll be back next week. And before you know it, it's going to be the Premier League starting again, as well as the other European seasons. But this weekend, it's the Championship, and it's Leagues Cup, it's Women's World Cup, and much, much more. Kartik, what are you going to do, and what should the listeners do?
Enjoy your football.